Hi guys, I hope you can hear me well and hope you're all safe and healthy. I'm Vidya Gopalkrishnan. I'm a SOC engineer with the Palo Alto Networks Security Operations Center. I specifically lead the threat hunting program within our SOC. So our SOC is not an MSSP. We do have a team that provides managed security services to other customers. But the team that I get to work with is responsible for preventing and detecting attacks from within our own corporate environment and safeguarding our own assets. So today we are going to delve into some of the practices we follow threat hunting wise, and we are specifically going to deal with what threat hunting means to a SOC when we say dark web or dark side of the internet. So some of the things that I'll be going through with you guys is what exactly does it mean? What does dark side of the internet mean? A little bit about the onion router or Tor, as some of you may have heard, and then I will delve sort of dive deep into how Palo Alto Networks SOC does it and how we use our tool set to be able to do such kind of hunting. So this iceberg analogy is something that most of us are familiar with. This is something that we most commonly use to represent what we find visible versus what we cannot trace or find. And the dark web, as we can say, sort of characterizes this analogy really well. When we say dark web from a human intelligence or from a news consumption or an intelligence consumption perspective, we know the dark web to be the haven for all sorts of illegal activities that tend to be pretty much largely anonymous. And so from a layman's perspective, that would mean information trading, black markets, sales, cryptocurrency mining, etc., sales of illegal things, etc. But from a technical perspective, and for a person who is day in and day out, defending your company's infrastructure or your organization's infrastructure, that basically translates to malicious IPs, domains, C2 channels, malware families, attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures. So that's what a blue team defender like me would be more worried about and more careful about. So when I say the dark web and that it's largely anonymous, what it is exactly, or why this anonymity, or what is enabling it to be so, and why as a blue teamer should I care about it? So when I say the dark web is anonymous, that is largely enabled through something called the onion router. And for those who are not familiar with it, the onion router is basically a protocol or a vector that is characterized by providing several layers of security in its network activity, such that the untraceability and anonymity component gets preserved. So given that anonymity and untraceability component, that is just going to provide ways for hackers to set up their command and control infrastructure, and it's also going to help them set up their exfiltration channels. Therefore, it can make them set up such kind of infrastructures without having us to be able to trace back to a particular server or hostname. And as you can see in that diagram, every hostname that is ever hosted within the Tor network is randomly generated, and it ends with a .onion suffix, which can only be accessed through the Tor network. So we care about this as blue team defenders primarily because of the C2 and exfiltration activity that goes on through these channels, and also because historically there have been very many APT or advanced persistent threat families and malware families that employ this Tor for their C2 channels. So all this seems to be really sweet for an attacker, but for a defender, the job just got tenfold more difficult. And that means where does a defender start, or how do they hunt? What is the criteria? What is the starting point? Should I just look at every activity starting from an attacker gaining information about my network through to command and control and actions on objective? Or should I focus my efforts more on an attacker already having progressed through to the right end of the life cycle? So this diagram is something that would probably be familiar to most of you in the cyber world. This is called the cyber attack lifecycle, and it diagrammatically sort of represents how an attacker progresses his attack from start to finish. And the lower part of the diagram that you see is the enterprise MITRE ATT&CK framework. So for those who aren't, again, familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's basically a comprehensive list of all techniques that have been published by MITRE Corporation that gives us a sort of a go-to list for saying, okay, these are the most commonly used attack tactics, techniques, and procedures. So basically, when I want to hunt for something, the philosophy is to focus on the right side of the life cycle, trust that my technology will prevent or detect it in the initial stages, and that my threat hunting activity ultimately leads to either finding gaps or finding evil, or enabling me to write more signatures or write more algorithms and detection mechanisms for me to be able to prevent it even before it reaches the farther end of the life cycle. As we know, most of the technologies that we use out there in the market are not 100% perfect. So therefore, that makes threat hunting a very essential job to do. And with respect to dark web activity, does it fit this definition? It absolutely does, because any Tor web-based activity usually falls under the command and control or under the exfiltration phases of attacks. So we just now saw a 10,000-foot view of, okay, this is how we do, a hunt, but then what exactly what exactly do we need to do the hunt? So let's just kind of bring it down a notch and try to see what is the data set that we would want and how at the Palo Alto Network SOC we do it. So the left side part of the slide that you see here is one that is most familiar for a lot of cybersecurity professionals. It's called the pyramid of pain. And as you can see, there are some very painful data sets that we day in and day out deal with in terms of hash values, IP addresses, domains, and static artifacts that always keep changing, meaning that one day the IP would be malicious, and probably in another 20 to 30 days they are cleansed out and can be even used for legitimate purposes. So those kind of static artifacts are pretty annoying, but at the same time, they're not totally inessential either. We will still need them for our sweeps, but at the same time, the ones that will make our hunts most effective are the ones that will deal with the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures of the attackers. So there are only a set or a very limited list of repetitive tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers use. And those kind of can be seen across a lot of malware families and across a lot of threat actors. So that is also something that we'll have to most importantly focus on. So how are we kind of fitting this philosophy or this framework into our tool set, and how are we going to enable our Tor Web Activity using our CapTor toolset, as I'd like to call it? So this tool set actually involves 4 of our very own tools. One is Cortex XDR, which is our endpoint detection and response platform. That particular platform helps for process attribution, meaning if there is any onion or any Tor web-based activity from the endpoint, it would attribute that to one particular process that is causing it from a user's endpoint. So we use that platform for that kind of endpoint-based data. We then use the Cortex data lake for network-based data, meaning any traffic that ever hit Tor exit nodes, for example. And for those who aren't familiar with what Tor exit nodes are, those are basically nodes or gateways for Tor, for all sorts of encrypted Tor traffic to leave the Tor network and enter into the internet. So by monitoring those exit nodes, we can also get a good sense of whether there's something Tor related or potentially malicious happening within our environment. So that is going to be our source for network sweep data. And lastly, but never the least, it's the Cortex autofocus. So autofocus is basically our threat intelligence platform. And what it does is it's going to aggregate the information from session, from endpoint, etc., and tag it against a set of behaviors or a set of activities which we have already known to be malicious, and club that all together as labels or as tags. So once we see those tags, we also would gain an overall view of any similar malware families that are exhibiting the same activity or similar malicious behaviors that we'll have to look at and hunt or pivot more. The central component is XSOAR, which is our automation and orchestration platform. And that is the platform that kind of like ties the sweep completely together. meaning I don't have to, pivot against each one of these tools, and I'm trying to make my hunt more automated and more sweep fashioned as possible, so that I get all the relevant sets of data, analyze it, and as an incident responder, I mainly focus on whether there's actual evil that's happening, and if there is, I respond to it and mitigate it and remediate it as need be. So for our use case for the Tor Web Activity, this is where we get into the weeds. So how exactly are we going to do it? We are going to look for .onion-based activity on our network from our endpoint, and then we're also going to look for the same .onion activity on our threat intel platform and see if there are associated behavioral families that are associated with it. This is the one tactic, or this is the one technique we are going to focus more on. It's called the MultiHop Proxy, and it's the tactic ID is actually T1188 on the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if you actually go into the MITRE ATT&CK website, you'll be able to see that this particular tactic deals with the use of Tor for attacks. And it also lists all the malware families that use Tor for their command and control or their exfiltration infrastructures. And some of the ones that I've underlined are known malware families. APT29 also has, as you can see, uses Tor hidden service for it to be able to communicate back to compromised hosts. So we're going to use this also as one of our sources of information to be able to do our hunt. So how's our workflow going to look like? This is kind of like the overall workflow. And if you guys have any questions on whatever I just said so far and whatever I'm going to do after this, please feel free to enter them all into the chat, and I would be more than happy to take them towards the end of this presentation. So let me just quickly go through to the workflow here. It first starts off with us being able to input all the relevant presets for us to be able to do the hunt. Meaning the exit node IP dump can be taken from very many sources, either from your threat intelligence platforms or from other open source intelligence sources as well. And then you will have to preset some of the metadata for the hunt for the tool sets that you're going to use. Meaning in this case, XDR and autofocus and Cortex data lake. So we are going to preset queries for XDR and for autofocus, meaning in XDR, which is our EDR platform, as I said, it already has a process attribution component to it, and that actually can be saved or can be like preset as a behavioral indicator of compromise, or BIOC, that as we call it. So that is the preset for XDR, to just look for onion, any sort of outgoing .onion activity from the endpoint. The next is the autofocus preset, where we look for the same kind of activity but across the network sessions, and possibly also try to see in the autofocus dump any machines that did not appear on XDR. Meaning, technically or ideally, all machines should have your endpoint agent deployed on them. But sometimes while you hunt, you might also kind of discover gaps in your own network, and you get to discover that there are some assets which have gone or which have been missed out for the agent to get deployed. So that's kind of like a technology gap or a control gap that you can figure out while you do the hunting process as well. So once that metadata is being set on whatever metadata management platform you're using, that and the manual IP dump and input that you're going to be given is going to be ingested by XOR, and all this data after being ingested is going to be swept through all the three tools through API integrations. And once that is done, the output of this playbook will sort of give you what are the exit IP hits on the network, if any, and then what are the session data that I got from my threat intelligence platform. What are the associated tags or behavioral tags? What are the BIOC results, meaning if there were any rule hits for this kind of activity from the endpoint. And then whatever indicators I've added, whatever presets I've added are also going to sit into the XOR indicator database, which I'll be showing you in a couple of moments from now. So once all of these relevant data sets are thrown at you, you just have to, kind of like correlate it all in the same interface and sort of come to a conclusion that whether or not something is an attack, whether or not something is an incident, and whether or not the incident response plan, or the IRP as we call it in the SOC, has to be kicked in. So that's kind of like the workflow. And let me quickly get into the demo. So this is the playbook that we have, developed on XOR. So as I just told, it's going to take the Tor indicators from manual inputs. It's going to preset some of the metadata, and once that is done, it's all of the inputs that I give are going to go and sit on the indicators database, which I will also show you. And here, once you get all the relevant data sets, you analyze, and you can also run, investigation and remediation playbooks against the incident. This is the indicators database that I was talking to you about. Here, what it does is XOR not only is the orchestration and automation platform, but it's also going to correlate all sorts of indicators from any incidents that you ever log in to the XOR interface. In a way, it's also going to act as its very own case management platform. You can also add your own indicator types, and I, for one, for this particular use case, have added a type of indicator called Tor IP, and this is how I've set it up. I've given a regex for it to parse accordingly, and then run an enhancement script or a reputation script for it to understand and look up against different internal sources. You can also format it and do such, basic parsing activities. And this can be preset, and there are already some out of the box, indicators that come readily, but this is just for purpose of our use case. So let's actually go into the playbook now and run it. So this is my weekly hunt ticket on which I'm going to run the playbook. As you can see, there's no evidence, there's nothing. There are just some preset data that has been, the metadata that has been set up in this ticket. So it's ingested the information from Jira, the definition of the pivot queries, etc., that it has to do against autofocus and XDR and such. So once that is done, we are just going to go ahead and execute the playbook itself. What I also forgot to mention is in the indicators database, you can also log an incident for a particular indicator. The create incident button that you just saw kind of lets you do that. But that aside, let's actually get into the meat of the demo. So we're going to run that playbook, and if we had done this manually, this might have probably taken 20 to 25 minutes at least. But here we are now going to input the Tor exit nodes. So I've actually taken it from an open source platform called Tor Status. You can take it from any of your management platforms to be able to hunt through that exit nodes. Although it's not super reliable because they are just IPs, we're still going to use that as part of our integrated approach. So once we have input that and all of the metadata has been processed, it's going to go ahead and hunt through all these 3 different sources. And whatever output is going to come out of this playbook is going to be added to this evidence board that you see right after the work plan tab. So in case there are no outputs or there are no hits for particular exit node IPs, you're not going to see any evidence attached to the incident. For those that actually did have some hits, those will be added to the evidence board, and you can just go ahead and sift through whatever information was returned. So now the playbook has been completed. Let's go and look at what output it gave me. So as you can see, there are some XDR hits, there are some autofocus hits, and there's also some sort of behavior that was observed from my threat intelligence platform. The outputs for the Cortex data lake integration was 0, so therefore that probably means that there was no network activity, and therefore you don't see that evidence here. So let's actually go and look into the autofocus data. Okay, so we have some weird looking i.sh file that called out to several different .onion servers. And it looks like the destination IPs are the assets in the environment itself, and the source IP looks external, and all of the URLs are it looks like there's a process that actually kept calling out to these IPs continually. We also see something called commodity.systemd miner under tags. This means that this particular activity that was observed in the network somehow is associated with this malware family called systemd miner. In case there were other tags or other malware families that were associated with the same kind of activity, those would appear here too. But in our case, this is the only thing that is appearing. So what is systemd miner, and why should we be worried about it? And even the URL says apt get something from a .onion server. So let's have a look at the top behavior that was observed. So this playbook is also going to parse out the tag information, throw out to you which are the tags that have been most frequently appearing on the data that was ingested. So it looks like it is a malware family, and it is a botnet that is associated with Linux operating systems. We can also view more details about it when we go into the new artifact here. So it says that it's a botnet that is used to spread for cryptocurrency mining and for profit making, and it shares an infrastructure with another botnet family, DDG botnet. So that kind of also gives us more context of, okay, so here's a malware family that is attacking my internal infrastructure, and it looks like it's calling it out. So let me also find out if there is any endpoint information associated with this particular or with these particular set of destination IPs that seem to have been attacked. So I go to the XDR or my EDR interface, and once you click on that link, this is the BIOC hits that actually come out. But the strange thing is we don't really see the same asset that is calling out to the IPs that we just saw. So the IP that we saw from the autofocus dump was like a 185 dot something IP, but this is 23 dot something. So this is most probably unrelated data, and at least from investigation we while we tested this out, we kind of concluded our investigation to say that this particular set of machines that is calling out to the 23 IP are basically researcher machines that that were kind of testing out scripts that were going out to .onion domains. So these are not particularly malicious, but these are still bad practices that you can log into your hunting ticket. If you ever want to know what the process attribution that I told you will look like, you can do that as well. So once you actually look at, kind of look closely into the data that XDR threw at you, you can look at what the path of the process that, that got created is like. And if you want to analyze it, you just click on Analyze. And once you analyze it, you actually can see something called the causality card that appears. Here, what will happen is it will show you a list of processes or a chain of processes that would have, that actually cause this onion activity. So as we already mentioned, this upon investigation was not related to the data set that we are more concerned about, which is the systemd miner traffic that we're seeing here. So let's look a little bit further into how we deal with this. As I said before, we can also save a particular query as a BIOC, and that's what this particular part of the demonstration shows you. So in order to confirm if this is actually systemd miner, you can also go ahead and look at an actual a Google search about what systemd miner is. And as you can see, many of the indicators and many of the details around this botnet seems to be exhibited by these two machines. So in order to take this further, we can then, if this were like a real attack, you would probably want to either reimage these machines or get down to incident responder mode. So within the XOR interface itself, I have something called quick commands or pre-built playbooks that I have built out to either remediate or enrich my data. So if I want to investigate more, I can definitely go for any of these enrichment playbooks. But given the fact that I'm fairly certain that there are a bunch of machines that called out to this particular IP, I am sure that those machines are compromised and this is bad traffic. So I would just go ahead and either reimage those machines or carry out whatever IRP processes that are relevant to your organizations. For the purposes of this demonstration, this was actually concluded to be lab activity, and therefore this can be logged out as a note, and you can go ahead and sort of close this incident out to say that everything has been taken care of and closed. So that kind of concludes my demonstration of how the sweep methodology works and how exactly we do it. And for those of you who are more curious about, hey, so how do I do more number of pivots? Is .onion the only kind of activity that I should look at? No, not necessarily. In one of the previous slides that I showed you, in the MITRE attack framework, there were a number of malware families that were associated with that particular technique. So autofocus already has these tagged together, and you can obviously put those as queries and have them be ingested as an additional pivot in your playbook as well. And as you can see here, the tags consists of very many malicious behaviors or malware families. It says that IP address lookup is one behavior. It resolves parked domains. It's probably PowerShell downloaders. So these are candidates for pivoting further and further and going more into the rabbit hole. So and that's why hunting for behaviors is even more effective and kind of like gets you more results. So I just wanted to quickly touch upon, if you want to ever hunt, you should also equally focus on changing them into alerts. But that could be done either way. There's always a catch-22 that we usually come across with, saying, hey, should we hunt or should we alert? It really depends on you trying to sort of balance that out together, and that's why there's that continuous approach of having to hunt and alert at the same time. So that kind of concludes my presentation. And if there are any questions, and I think we're already kind of out of time. And so yeah, if there are any other questions apart from this, you can always reach out to me towards the end or after the session. There are some questions over here. How do you backtrack an exit node into an entry node? How do you backtrack an exit node to an entry node? In the instance of data breaches where information has landed in the dark web, what is the best course of action? I think, like, in the instance where data breaches did happen and it did result, being in the dark web, the utmost that, at least from a SOC perspective, that you can do is mitigate it and, do all the necessary change control mechanisms that you have to. And if there is a breach, there is a breach, and sometimes the course of action, the best course of action is not only to just follow your IRP, but also work with the necessary stakeholders from within your company, such that the right kind of legal and retaliatory action is taken. Are indicators like signatures? Not necessarily. Yes, they can be used as a signature, but then indicators themselves cannot be very reliable signatures. Because, as I said, indicators are static observables like IPs and domains and hashes. They are all temporal, and they usually, get they kind of like vanish out or expire very soon. So I would rather prefer a behavior like saying, hey, if a particular process is doing a lot of enumeration into my endpoint, make that as my signature. So those kind of behaviors can be better signatures as opposed to XYZ hash being a signature by itself. Are there any instances of false positives? Every hunting will always get you false positives, because hunting is meant to kind of weed out some of the false positives so that you can promote an exercise from hunting to an alerting exercise. So yes, we do have false positives, but we will encounter false positives. But once you scope your hunt down to a particular set of data, the amount of false positives that you're going to see could drastically reduce. And that's why it's important that you be intentional about what you look for. What if the malicious actor uses virtual machines to perform the attack or deploy malware? So our goal here is to basically so again, when you are in defensive security, you don't really get into the offense and try to attack back, or sometimes when it happens through Tor nodes, it's going to be difficult to track it down. But my presentation over here largely focuses on, yes, we have those kind of encrypted traffic come across in the network, but this is how you can you don't have to trace back to the actual application from which the attacker is running the malware, but you can always track back to the behavior or the overall behavior and kind of get context off of it. So yes, he can do it from a virtual machine, and maybe we will not be able to track that down, but then the process or the impact that it's creating on your endpoint and whatever is visible to you is something that you can definitely control and mitigate accordingly. Are your outputs limited to the indicator's input? Yes, and indicators inputted, no. So there's one thing. So there's one task in the playbook that only looks for the exit node IPs that I input. But then the queries that I preset as part of the metadata in my hunting ticket is something that looks for a large amount of activity. And that's how we got to conclude or got to identify something being affected by the systemd miner botnet. And I think we have almost gotten to all the questions. It's already 5 minutes over, so if there's anything more that you ever want to talk to me about, or you're curious about how every playbook works, or how automations can work, and how you can automate your hunting program if you have one in your organization, feel free to jump into a chat with me over the virtual portal, and I'll be more than happy to clarify your questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Hope you all stay safe out there. Thank you.